Um, when I was a preschooler, my parents, especially my dad, doted on me because he thought I was so very intelligent and so smart. So I was always getting encouragement at home. And when I entered school at age 5, I didn't know that I was going to live in that building. And I lived there for 10 years, going home only during holidays. At that time, it was mandatory for little one for treaty Indians, and I'll say Indians because that was the language that we used for us back then. And when I was in grade 7, I I realized that I loved reading, and I loved classrooms, going to class, because it was a draw for me, and I loved it because in front of me was a real teacher, a teacher with credentials. So that kind of spurred me on for it to have that. I would have had the love of learning anyway. And so, but seeing someone that was an actual credentialed teacher, I glowed, and that was my one bright spot. In my role as a student over the years, we were never to ask questions, just take orders. And so when I went home at Christmas time, I told my parents I wasn't going back the last half of my grade 12. And they didn't say anything. They just said, well, okay, if you want to do it that way. So I stayed home. And during that last half, I had this yearning. It was really um, super uh, wanting to go to further my education. I missed it. Um, that year, that summer, instead of finishing, I got married. I got married and had children in the next 10 years, and 10 to 12 years perhaps. And I lost my mom then. My mom died young, and I was still a teenager. And so life went on the raising children. And when I had my 7th child, that yearning was always still there, that I wanted to go to university. At that time, I didn't know the yearning to become a teacher wasn't quite as strong as it was earlier on. I the summer of when my youngest son was born, when my youngest child was born, um, my younger brother got went was accepted at university, had just graduated, and he showed me, and I cried. I cried because I was so envious of him that he had his diploma, and he was doing something I'd wanted to do all my life. At this point in time, I had 3 preschoolers, 2 preschoolers, one that was just entering kindergarten, and the other 2 were just preschoolers, and a young baby a few months old. And so I decided to write a letter. I wrote a letter to the University of Brandon, and I wrote a biography, how I was forced to go to residential school at the age of 5. The last month, in August, I received a letter from the University of Brandon, and they said, we received your letter, and based on what you wrote, we're inviting you to come to Brandon and to be interviewed and to go into the special program that we have. Uh, I thought that was the greatest gift ever. And I'm thinking, well, I have 7 children. What am I going to do with them? So my husband had a good job. He was, um, he was taking care of his family, and we had a vehicle. But I had no rights back then. We had absolutely women were subservient to their husband. And so one day, and time was coming closer, and I, tried to solve my problem and say, how am I going to tell my husband? So I decided that there used to be in the next town, they used to have bingo back then, which they still do, I guess. And I asked him, he was on the 4 to 12 shift, and I said, can I borrow the car? And he looks at me, something I'd never done. He says, why? He says, I said, because I heard there was a big pot and I'd like to go and win that money. And he said, okay. I didn't even have a driver's license. So I, I dropped him off, and he said, okay, you pick me up at 12. And I said, okay. I turned the car around, went back to the res, and ran into my brand new house. And I told my oldest daughter, I said, pack the kids, we're leaving, we're going to Brandon. Oh, no questions asked, pack the kids. And we left. I wrote a note to my husband, and I said, I left to go to Brandon, and I'm going to university. I've taken the kids. Talk to you later. And we didn't even have a phone. There would have been no way to communicate. And I wrote, love, Mary. And that's how I ran away to go to post-secondary. I drove, and we must have gotten there about 1 o'clock in the morning, 2 o'clock, I don't recall. I had to ask directions as to how to go to university, how to get to Brandon. And then when I got there, I had a phone number where my brother was, and he had this one little room that he had rented. And so I finally found it with the help of the Brandon police, and I found his apartment, a baby in my arms, and 6 other children following. Knocked on the door, can't open the door, and he says, what are you doing here? And I said proudly, I'm going to university. And he said, oh. He opens the door and says, this is it? Where are you going to sleep? Oh, I have blankets in the car. Brought the blankets, and we all slept on the floor. That started my life, another life.